Questions? Oh, back there, Owen. Mm-hmm. 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 I don't know. I mean, I think we've looked at it. Including temperature gradients in the semiconductor modeling equations is relatively straightforward. It's done in power devices, for example. For the situations here, the effects are very small. Okay, the temperature, just because the power levels are pretty small, 0.1 watts per square centimeter, the thermal conductivity of the silicon is high enough that you don't see the kind of things you'd see in a high-power transistor that way. I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
Going back to the European Union, 47% of nameplate installed capacity last year was photovoltaic, but the availability of PV is, I guess, 25 to 30%.
Right.
So that cuts it down. Now, gas is, or anything with the availability of gas could actually take that 47% down.
If you wanted it on an energy equivalent basis, it would. That's why I put the total energy was 11%. So, okay, that wasn't of the new capacity. That was for.
It's still really impressive.
Yeah, and the capacity factor of a PV plant depends on location, but it's anywhere from 30% in a desert with a tracker, one-axis tracker, to under 20 or even 15 or less in Germany on a roof. And to compare that, the overall capacity factor of the U.S. generation asset is about 48%. Okay, so if you take all of the power generating assets in the U.S., we run them at about 48%. Okay, now some have to be run more, like nuclear power plants, and those would tend to be in the 90+ capacity factor. Some are used as intermediate load and scheduled to come up as the daytime load increases due to air conditioning. But if you average over all of the assets, all the way down to the so-called peakers that follow the small fluctuations, it's about 48%. So in that sense, solar is about half the average. Okay, so if you want just a rough rule of thumb comparison, take half of those numbers is the equivalent, generating, because it's and if you look at what's called the daytime capacity factor, or if you look at even more economically, if you look at the PG&E peak rate, summer peak rate, the capacity factor of a solar plant during PG&E summer peak period is much, much higher. Yeah, right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, people are learning about the problems of high penetration PV on the grid, and in fact, there's a portal at NREL on the DOE website called the High Penetration PV Portal, and it has all the latest research on this. What I can tell you is that the history of it is kind of interesting. From the very first grid-connected PV, the local utilities fought it tooth and nail, saying that it would destabilize the grid, it would be unsafe, and then some PV got it hooked up, and the utilities finally said, well, that's okay, but 0.1%, if you cross that threshold, everything's going to come apart. And that happened, in California over 10 years ago. And then they said, well, okay, but 1%, that's our line in the sand. If we get 1% of this non-dispatchable fluctuating resource, we won't be able to deal with it. We went through that about more than 5 years ago. And they said, okay, there's nothing bad's happened, but 5%, that's our last offer. We're not going to go over 5%. And now we're going through the 5%. Germany is, on many days is over 40% PV in the summer. And Spain is even higher. And Spain is particularly interesting because they're not connected to any other by really stiff transmission to local countries. Germany's connected to France and to the Netherlands and has the ability to sell excess power and buy power from their neighbors, whereas Spain doesn't. And Spain has been dealing with it just fine. It's not easy. The utilities they take it as a challenge. This in-world high penetration portal has done wonderful things, and they've modeled the whole U.S. With the giant supercomputer that DOE has, and they have modeled PV at various penetrations, wind at various penetrations, and in this model are all the transmission lines that need to be built, time of day, all the statistics, the fluctuations and everything, and they have recently published a paper that they say you can get to 80% wind in PV, and that's done. It's done by a combination of things: transmission, which aggregates fluctuations over distance. It's done by a modest amount of storage, local storage, community storage. It's done by demand-side management, where a lot of companies agree that that the local grid operator has the ability to shut their power back a little bit if they need that power and they get a lower rate because of it. Or customers, a good example of demand-side management is you might agree to have your water heater shut off for half an hour at peak times. You'd never even notice it because it would still stay hot. But that little peak shaving enables the utility to get through a particularly difficult time without starting up a gas-fired power plant, for example. So there's a lot of these things fluctuating around. So the final answer is somewhere between 20 and 80%, I think. Using existing technology. Now, obviously, massive storage that's very cheap and easy to deploy would change that paradigm.